So we've been doing a series on Proverbs, and last week we started a short mini-series on wise stewardship within our Proverbs series. And we're in part 2 of that. Last week we talked about avoiding debt and actually looked at the cold, hard numbers about that, which is pretty eye-opening. And tonight in part 2, we're going to see how generosity is another... Bless you. We'll see how generosity is another core piece to wise stewardship. Let me start with how God connected me with this topic of generosity. So, the summer after I graduated from college, I was still living in Ann Arbor, and I was walking across campus, and unlike Saginaw and SVSU, Ann Arbor and U of M kind of blend together in certain areas. And so there's some homeless people from the city that kind of wander onto campus occasionally and asking for money. And there was one homeless man in particular who I saw pretty frequently, but every time I would just completely ignore him because I was in my own self-centered little world. And as I passed by on this one occasion, God started to convict me about my selfishness. And I wasn't just selfish when it came to giving to the needy, pretty much in every area of my life. And when the offering plate came around at church, I would sometimes put in just enough to appease my conscience, and kind of like I'd see how much do I have to spare, and that would be my philosophy. And I wasn't even generous with my friends. I wasn't hospitable, just kind of selfish and greedy. And I was a nice person, but when it came to money, it didn't come out of my hands very easily. And as I passed by this homeless man, whom I recognized because I'd passed by him so many times before, God began to convict me. And I tried to ignore it. I tried to look straight ahead, didn't make eye contact, and hope the feeling would go away. But it didn't, and it just kind of built in me throughout the afternoon. And I was a brand new Christian. I'd just been baptized through a student church that I was involved with, and God was beginning to do so many things in my life. And so I finally took the hint and realized, okay, God, I see you're trying to convict me about my views on money. And so at the next opportunity for generosity that you put in front of me, I'm going to do something about that. I prayed that to God. And then the phone rang, like right then. And one of my friends from that student church was joining the staff of that student church. And so she was calling me up to ask if we could meet one-on-one to talk about joining her support team because she was raising support to do campus ministry. I was like, really, God? Like in my mind, I expected, well, in the next few days, maybe the next few weeks, I'll see this homeless guy again, and I'll give him something. But I prayed and told God I was willing, and then he's like, boom, you're doing it right now, and you're going to do it consistently. And so I signed on as one of her monthly supporters, and it was something. It was a start. And that was right about the time I got a job. And it wasn't like a great job, but it was a job. And then I started learning about tithing, and this girl was married, and her husband was starting to raise support to join the staff of the campus ministry. So I started supporting him. And then a couple other people were on staff, and a couple of my other close friends from that student church were going to join the staff, and we're starting to raise support. So I started supporting them. And then I got the really good job that I really wanted, and so I bumped up their support. So as I became more intentional and free about my giving, the more God seemed to bless me. In a very short time span, God completely changed my view on finances. I went from being stingy about my money to starting to become a steward about God's money. And maybe God's done something similar in your life. Maybe you had been kind of on the stingy side, but you trusted God with some finances and He blessed you. And then another opportunity for generosity happened, and he blessed you even more. And it became this crazy blessing cycle. Maybe you grew up in a family that taught godly stewardship, and you were raised with the concept of generosity and hospitality, and you just kind of grew up with that. Or maybe you're where I was at in college, and it was pretty hard to get the open hand to let money out of it. So whatever our history is with that, I hope we'll see tonight that generosity is just as vital to wise stewardship as avoiding debt. Generosity is just as vital to wise stewardship as avoiding debt. If we avoid debt, do our best to pay the smallest amount of interest possible in this country, that's very smart. But if we stop there with our finances, that's not the wisest thing to do with our finances. We might scratch our heads and think, how can giving money away be wise? Because then I'll have less of it. But godly wisdom often messes with worldly wisdom in a lot of different ways. And tonight we're going to see how that's the case with generosity. So let's take a look at our theme passage for tonight. It's Proverbs 11:24. Proverbs 11:24 is our theme proverb for the night. One gives freely, yet grows all the richer. Another withholds what he should give and only suffers want. That doesn't make any sense. That's what it is. If the God of the Bible were not real, there'd be no reason for this proverb to be true. It doesn't make sense as far as worldly accounting. But some of us here know from experience that this proverb is very true. One gives freely, yet grows all the richer. Another withholds what he should give and only suffers want. So let's look at a passage from the New Testament that kind of adds some perspective to this proverb, and especially the first half of it. So Matthew 6, verses 2 through 4, this is from the Sermon on the Mount, which was the longest sermon that Jesus addressed a crowd in the Bible. And Matthew 6, verses 2 through 4, Jesus said, "Thus when you give to the needy, sound no trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may be praised by others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you." So I want to highlight three things about this passage from the Sermon on the Mount that are going to help us understand our proverb. So three takeaways from Matthew 6, verses 2 through 4. Number one is expected giving. Expected giving. Jesus did not teach if you give to the needy as if it was some sort of optional thing. He says when you give to the needy. He expects his followers to be giving. The second thing is humble giving. Humble giving. When Jesus is talking about giving in secret in this passage, it's not like secret at all costs. Some people are so uptight about their gift being in secret, nobody knows about it, and they'd be tempted to lie about it so nobody knows what their gift is. That's not what Jesus is talking about. He's talking about our attitude, our motive for giving. The chapter right before this, at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus tells us to let our lights shine so that people will see our good works and praise the Father in heaven. But here in Matthew 6, Jesus says the hypocrites do things to be seen so that they get the praise instead of God getting the praise. So it's an attitude. I think it's healthy for people to know that you give because generosity inspires generosity and hypocrisy quenches it, extinguishes it. But others don't need to know how much you give. That's the secret part. They don't need to be oblivious that you give because your giving can inspire them, but they don't need to know how much you give. That way, that can help us keep a humble attitude about our giving and still be a good example and good inspiration to others. The third thing from Matthew 6 is rewarded giving. Rewarded giving. Jesus tells us that when we give with the right motives to honor God, that God the Father will reward us for that. So that's why this first half of this proverb works. It's not math, it's a promise. It's not math, but it's a promise. Now, last week we focused on the math. This week we're focusing on God's promises. So, looking at our proverb again, one gives freely, it grows all the richer. Another withholds what he should give, only to suffer want. So what about that second half of the proverb? How can I keep extra for myself and end up in need when I wouldn't have been in need if I would have given some of it away? Again, that doesn't make sense from the world's point of view. But it's true, again, because God steps in and intervenes. So here's another passage to give us perspective about our proverb. Malachi 3, verses 8 through 10. Malachi 3, verses 8 through 10. If you're not really familiar with the book of Malachi, it's the last book of the Old Testament. It's like the page before the book of Matthew. Malachi 3, verses 8 through 10 says, "Will a mere mortal rob God? Yet you rob me. But you ask, how are we robbing you? In tithes and offerings. You are under a curse, the whole nation, because you are robbing me. Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. Test me in this, says the Lord Almighty. See if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing, there will not be enough room to store it." So, to kind of summarize it, with God's blessing, things work out better than they should in our favor. With God's blessing, things work out better than they should in our favor. But with God's curse, things work out worse than they should against us. With God's curse, things work out worse than they should against us. But please note, we're talking about giving financially, but we're not talking about the reward or the curse being strictly financial. It could be blessings or curses physically or relationally. For example, wherever your starting point is tonight, if you decide, I'm going to step up my generosity, and you won't necessarily receive a financial blessing because of that. You may, but you may receive a blessing in another way. Maybe your relationships will take a turn for the better. Maybe this dream that you are pursuing suddenly has a roadblock removed from it. So the blessings might come in different ways. They might come financially, but they might come in a lot of different ways. So God's blessing is God's blessing. It doesn't matter what form it takes. God's blessing is God's blessing. It doesn't matter what form it takes. So that addresses the increase part. It addresses the suffering need part of the proverb. But I think there's some remaining questions to help us apply this proverb to our lives. And like I've been saying in this series, the point of the Proverbs is the Proverbs beg us to insert ourselves into the proverb and put ourselves, consider it in our own lives. So let's give it some tangibility. Again, one gives freely, yet grows all the richer. Another withholds what he should give and only suffers want. So what does it mean to give freely? Where does that go? What does God consider right for us to give? If we answer these questions, they'll give us some clarity and objectivity about whether we're doing this, whether we're being generous or not, whether we're applying it in our lives. So let's consider what's right to give. We already read Malachi 3, verses 8 through 10. And in that, God considered it theft if the Israelites didn't bring their full tithe to him. And a tithe means 10% of your total gross income. A tithe is 10% of your total gross income. That's what it means. And why do I specify that it's your gross income, not your net income from your check? In Matthew 22:21 and some other verses that basically say the same thing, Jesus told us to give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God's. He doesn't tell us give to God out of what's left over after you give to Caesar. Give God his full portion, give Caesar, the government, their full portion. And if you voted, and if the candidate you voted for wins tonight, that's going to have a direct impact on Caesar's portion for the next 4 years. But God's share does not change. He owns it all. God owns it all. He only asks for 10% of it back. So, but that tithe, the 10%, that was Old Testament stuff, right? So, what's a Christian supposed to give? There's not a lot of talk about tithing in the New Testament. Some people know that. Some people, that's a surprise to them. In Matthew 23, and Luke 11:42, pretty much say the same thing again. Jesus kind of indirectly says you should tithe. It's not a clear everybody should tithe, but he basically said it was a good thing. So that's about it that the Bible, that the New Testament talks about tithing, but there's a ton in the New Testament about generosity. So consider this. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus took the Old Testament law of not murdering, and he took it further and said, don't hate. Jesus took the Old Testament law of not committing adultery, and he took it further and said, don't lust. And so, if the Old Testament required 10%, and the New Testament tells us to be generous, which direction do we think that goes? Up through my college career, I thought that generous meant anything above 0%. That's what I thought generous meant. But now, based on the example of the New Testament, I think generosity is supposed to start at a tithe and go up from there. If we're giving less than what's expected, that's not really generous yet. So, to answer our question, what's right for us to give? Generosity starts at 10% and goes up from there. Generosity starts at 10% and goes up from there. One gives freely and becomes all the richer. Another withholds what he should give and suffers want. So that kind of also addresses the idea of giving freely, being generous, it's giving freely. But what about where does that go? Well, in Proverbs 11:24, which is our theme proverb, giving freely comes from the Hebrew mephazer, which literally means to scatter. So, he who scatters gains even more, and he who withholds what is right suffers need, suffers want. So, that's a practical, important detail, kind of like how much we should give. It tells me that I'm not just giving freely to a single bucket. The word scatter kind of implies that the money's landing in more than one spot, in multiple spots. So I don't expect 100% of your financial giving to go into his house box. But likewise, if you go somewhere on Sunday and they try to tell you that 10% of your income belongs to that specific church, I don't think that's really biblically substantiated. As Christians, we need to see what the New Testament teaches about where our giving should go and what those destinations are, because it's actually a little different from what the Old Testament taught for the Israelites. In the Old Testament, the entire tithe went to the temple in Jerusalem, and that funded all Jewish ministry. The priests and the Levites, and when they did building maintenance, they paid the singers and musicians, and the temple guards, like every part of Jewish ministry was paid from the tithe to the temple. And what about in the New Testament? Today, do all Christian ministries funnel through the same place? They don't. Today we have a lot of different ministries. We have a lot of different types of ministries that fulfill what Jesus tells us to do in the New Testament. So, where are Christians supposed to give? There's three main places that the New Testament talks about where Christians are supposed to give. First one is the local church. Acts 4 verses 36 through 37 talks about Barnabas. This guy sold a field that he owned, and then he took the money and brought it to the church leaders, his local church. 1 Timothy 5 verses 17 and 18, basically saying to pay your church staff well. And I hope, as you think about giving to your local church, this right here should be considered part of your local church. It's a student church, yes, but hopefully it's a place where you're growing and serving spiritually. So the second place is to support missions in other places. To support missions in other places. Philippians 4 verses 10 through 19 is basically a support letter that the Apostle Paul is writing to the church in Philippi, the Philippians, and he's thanking them for their financial gift that allowed him to go on his missionary journeys. In Luke 8 verses 1 through 3, it talks about this group of women who are giving financially to support Jesus and his disciples as they traveled from town to town to spread the gospel. So at this point would include any ministry or missionary who helps spread the gospel, does Christian ministry in a place that you're not. That's what it means, whether that's domestic or whether that's overseas. Support missions in other places. And someday, unless you decide to stay and become part of his house staff, there will come a point where you will transition out of campus ministry and into a community church somewhere and step up your involvement there. And when that happens, his house kind of magically transforms from being your local church to being that mission to another place. Isn't that neat how that works? So 5, 10, 20 years after you graduate, his house is still going to be here, sharing the gospel, discipling students, trying to connect with international students who will go all over the world. And our staff needs that financial support of Christians just as much as the brick building where people go on Sunday needs it. So keep that in mind as you think about your long-term giving after you actually get a good paying job someday. So the third place is to the needy. To the needy. And especially, the Bible says, to fellow Christians. Matthew 6, verses 2 and 3, that's what we read already. Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount talked about giving to the needy. Romans 12:13 says, providing for the needs of the saints. Romans 15:26 talks about helping the poor among the saints. So we're supposed to give to the needy and especially to family that is needy. And a very great practical way that you can apply that this week is to pack a shoebox and or give money towards Operation Christmas Child, which is being collected next week. Whether you give through an organization like Samaritan's Purse, that's the group that does Operation Christmas Child, or Compassion International, who you can sponsor a child in another place, or whether you give to an individual on the street, whether you help someone out in the church who's in a tough spot, or you pay money to participate in a mission trip that blesses and meets needs of people, of the poor. Any and all of that counts as giving towards the needy. And I know a lot of us have hesitancies about giving to the needy, especially if we think about like just some random guy on the street. But think about this. God doesn't call us to account for how they'll use the money. He just calls us to be generous. God doesn't call us to account for how they'll use the money. He just calls us to be generous. So, can you go to the next screen? Thank you. I've had that doubt in my mind before, and when I got this perspective, it helped me. You know, if you give to one person and they really need it, they use it for food and toiletries, were you generous? Yeah. If you give to this other person and they abuse it, that was on them, but were you generous? Yeah, we still did our part of being generous. So those are 3 areas where we should give as Christians, and the New Testament doesn't really divvy it up for us as to where to put it. It doesn't say put a third towards your local church and a third towards missions and a third towards the needy, or 50% to the church and 30 to missions and 20 to the needy. It doesn't break it down for us, and I think God intentionally left that kind of vague so we would listen to the Spirit's leading when opportunities come our way, and kind of depending on how He wires us, we can adjust those levels a little bit differently for each of us. But regularly giving something to all 3 areas is the best way that we can honor God. So, review our proverb again. One gives freely, yet grows all the richer. Another withholds what he should give, and only suffers want. And even if any of us here personally still has a hard time getting our hand open to share with others, because we want it, because we want it, we got ideas for it, we got plans for it. But think about this. Isn't it wisest financially, we'll get the most benefit from if we line ourselves up to receive God's blessing versus if we hold back a little bit and don't have God's blessing, which is going to be the long-term benefit in our lives. So let me pray.